So we're in chapter 9 of your United States history class, and we are going to be going into the Louisiana Purchase. So you probably know about this. So the Louisiana Purchase, starting with Napoleon's plans for the New World, because who do we buy it from? France, Napoleon. And so the attempt to buy New Orleans and how Napoleon sells it, and the purchase violates Jefferson's principles. Remember, he didn't want to have a national bank, or he didn't want to buy anything or spend any money. Well, he has had the greatest deal of the century come to him. And on to the exploration of the Louisiana Territory, and that's the Lewis and Clark expedition, right? And then we're going to end with Zebulon Pike's expedition to Colorado, and what happens in the midst of all that. So let's begin. Napoleon's plans for the New World. Well, Napoleon, he was this dictator of France at this time, and he had an idea that he wanted to basically have a whole new world, right? And that he would run, he would be the leader of the world, a new empire ruling the world. So on October 1st, 1800, Spain signed a treaty with France, surrendering the territory of the Louisiana, which was kind of weird because basically Spain signed this treaty, gave the territory of Louisiana to them, but basically told them they couldn't sell it. Well, Napoleon does not always go by the rules, right? So Napoleon wanted to use it, though, as a breadbasket, basically to provide food to feed his workers and slaves on the sugar plantations in the West Indies. So, but in America, there was concern about France owning this land next to ours, right? Because they knew France was in turmoil and was actually attacking our ships and everything else. So now France is going to be right next to us, in Louisiana territory. So they were concerned, like, oh dear, and what is this Napoleon going to do? So France was very volatile at this time, and so they thought this might cause a war with France, and France will come in, through Louisiana on that side of the Mississippi and attack us. So it says, the day France takes possession of Louisiana, we must marry ourselves to Great Britain and the British fleet. Basically they were saying, if France comes in, we need to have an ally with Britain then, because, we won't be able to fight Britain and France both, right? So on October 2nd, 1802, the United States lost the right of deposit in New Orleans. So basically France said, you know what, we're not going to let the Americans come to New Orleans. Well, New Orleans was a big port, and our ships were coming in through New Orleans on the Mississippi River. So this cut our trade, that we could not use the New Orleans as our port. And we could not come in that way, and we could not, actually, come through the Mississippi River. So there were some attempts to buy New Orleans at this time. So Thomas Jefferson says, well, let's go talk to Napoleon and see if we can buy the city of New Orleans. And that way we can bring in our ships there. See what Napoleon says. So, of course, a lot of Westerners were demanding war with France at this time. They really did not care for Napoleon. But Jefferson notified Livingston, his foreign diplomat, to France. And he said, see if you can buy New Orleans. Maybe even Florida, some of Florida, that France would turn over that part of Florida too. And, that where the Mississippi is. So he sent Livingston, but he also sent James Monroe to follow up on Livingston. Maybe he didn't know if Livingston would be that powerful enough, or that dignified to Napoleon. I don't know. But he sent James Monroe too. And so the Congress then approved, yes, well, we see if we can buy New Orleans for like $2 million. In fact, you can go all the way up to $10 million. So we wanted to buy New Orleans for up to $10 million. Don't go over $10 million. That's all that Congress would approve, is $10 million to buy New Orleans. Right here is the big secret. It says, secretly, under the pressure from Napoleon Bonaparte, King Charles of Spain, sorry about that, King Charles of Spain would give all of Louisiana, including New Orleans, back to France on the condition that it would be not sold or given to anybody else. Well, of course, Napoleon, he's thinking, I don't have to go buy the book, right? Napoleon thinks he's dictator. He thinks he's God, right? So anyway, here we go. Here's a picture of the signing. So we're talking about Louisiana Purchase, you know. So Napoleon sells Louisiana. Let's see what happened. So the French troops, remember the French troops were coming to America because they wanted to actually raise some food in Louisiana territory for feed their slaves in Haiti. And so basically in Haiti, they had this big revolt, and then Napoleon had to send some troops to America. And he says, man, I'm going to have to send my military now over to America, you know, too. So he thought, I'm fighting this war here in Europe. He was fighting against England, and he was fighting against the world in Europe. So he's going to have to divide his troops. So his prospect of funding his wars was more important to him. So he thought, I really need to fund my wars. I don't need a wilderness. He's thinking, I don't need that wilderness. So he was hesitant to send any troops to America at all. And so Louisiana seemed pretty useless to Napoleon. He goes, what's there? A bunch of wild Indians and, you know, land and stuff that I don't need? So he needed money. He wanted money because he wanted money so that he could build up his military and fight his war in Europe. So he didn't need a wilderness. So he offered his foreign minister not only to buy New Orleans, but he said, when these guys come from America, when these people come from the United States, offer them, they're wanting to buy New Orleans, he knew. But he said, offer them that stinking whole Louisiana. You know, he said, go ahead and see if they want to buy it all. So here's a picture. We have Jefferson and we have James Monroe here, Madison, and on to Livingston. And they're making this deal, the deal of the century, the deal of history, really. This deal to buy the Louisiana Purchase. So Napoleon, his offer astonishes Livingston. So here's Livingston by himself. And he thinks, I don't have any authority to buy the whole territory, the whole Louisiana. I don't have authority to do this. I don't have how am I? And of course we don't have communication. We don't have telephones, and we don't have TV, and we don't have email. So he had to how could he get the message to him that Napoleon wanted to buy this? So James Monroe shows up, and he arrives like in the nick of time, because Livingston is just like, he's a wreck. He doesn't know what he should do. And so Monroe comes in, and he had no time to consult Thomas Jefferson or even Congress. And so Napoleon might change his mind and just say, I was going to sell it, but I decided not to. So they thought they couldn't pass up the deal. And so James Monroe talks to Robert Livingston saying, we need to buy this. You see, we could buy New Orleans up to $10 million, and that's just a little city. And now he wants to sell us the whole country, the whole Louisiana territory for only $15 million. And so Monroe started to deal with him and said, okay, we'll agree to pay your $15 million. 3/4 of this will go to France, but the other 1/4 has to be a settlement on American claims against France for interference in trade. You went in and interfered with our trade and our ships and everything, attacking our ships, and we need to cover them too. So Napoleon goes and thinks, I said 15 million and they're gonna go for it. So Napoleon says, yeah, I'll go for it. Now Napoleon's saying, yes, I'll take the deal. They shook on the deal with Monroe and Livingston. Jefferson didn't even know about it yet, and neither did Congress. So basically they were taking a big risk, especially with Napoleon, you can imagine. So when they got back with Thomas Jefferson thought, wow, this is a great deal. So Thomas Jefferson, this went against his politics, because he criticized Adams and especially Alexander Hamilton on the national debt and also on the bank. Remember, he didn't really want a bank. Well, he definitely would need a bank if he was going to buy the Louisiana Purchase, right? And also it went against his national debt because he wanted to reduce the national debt. And here he was going to pay $15 million to Napoleon Bonaparte, right? So here we go. How could he spend $15 million of the taxpayers' money, he thought. So he had to figure out how to do this. Remember, he had a strict idea of the Constitution. Basically, the Constitution cannot be elastic. We just have to go with the Constitution the way it is. But he himself had to go with the elastic clause because the Constitution did not say or grant the federal government to buy any land or purchase any territories. So how was he going to do this in time to pay for the money to give to Napoleon? So he had a dilemma. For this 1803, $15 million would be less than 3 cents an acre. You know, I mean, it would be a ridiculous deal. So he had to now go talk to Congress. So Jefferson persuades the Congress. He tells, and they're looking like, oh my goodness, this is a great deal. So he asked Congress to propose a constitutional amendment to purchase this land. And he knew that ratification of a new amendment would take way too long. Napoleon could easily back down, and he needed to give Napoleon the money right away. So he's thinking, how can I do this? We can't go through a whole process of amending the Constitution. So he said, possibly, as the Constitution said, in the Constitution it said, that the Constitution would have the power to make treaties. So he thought, well, we'll call this a treaty. We'll call this a treaty with Napoleon, with France, a France treaty. Well, he was really using that elastic clause, wasn't he? He was really kind of saying, of pulling that out and using it. But he thought, I need to do this because we need to pay for him. That was not the way Thomas Jefferson would behave with the Constitution. He would basically say, we cannot do these without going through the process of amending the Constitution. But he knew he had to. So he went to Congress. Of course, the Federalists opposed it, ironically, because remember, the Federalists were ones that usually had the elastic clause, and they believed in the elastic clause. They had used it for the national bank. So it went against Jefferson's politics. He needed a national bank, and he needed money, so he needed to basically use the elastic clause in saying this would be a treaty. So the treaty was ratified anyway because most of the Congress said, yes, we need to buy this land and it will be our treaty until they could fix it later. So this was the greatest deal in American history. On October 1803, the Louisiana Purchase became official, and the one purchase doubled the size of the United States. So here is a picture of it. Here's the United States, and here's the purchase. Doubled our size. And no one, though, was as certain of the exact borders, and very little was known about the climate and the geography of the Louisiana Purchase. And President Jefferson convinced Congress to appropriate funds. He said, we need to explore this. We don't even know what's over there, you know? We know there's a bunch of French fur trappers over there that were over there and a lot of Native Americans, but we need to go and find out about our purchase. And so the Congress decides to give the appropriate funds. And so Thomas Jefferson commissions his secretary, his name is Meriwether Lewis, and Lieutenant William Clark was the lieutenant. He was the younger brother of George Rogers Clark, which had put down some actually put down some Indian uprisings. So he really trusted that George Rogers Clark would know about the Native Americans. And both Lieutenant Clark and Meriwether Lewis, was kind of scientific, would be able to keep journals and really tell him what was over there in the Louisiana Purchase. We called this the Lewis and Clark Expedition. The Lewis and Clark Expedition would explore our Louisiana territory. Meriwether Lewis was more of, like I said, a scientist and a botanist and a biologist, and so he would take in a lot of samples of what was growing there and what would grow there and the soil and all that. And Clark would be their protection. So Lewis and Clark were a good pair in that. And so they started in St. Charles, Missouri, and they organized 50 men. And they thought we need to have some hunters, because we're going to have to hunt for food when we're there. We need some boatmen, because we're going to have to go on the river. We need some gunsmiths, because we got to have guns to hunt, and to protect ourselves from the Native Americans that might attack us. And we have to have blacksmiths and carpenters and cooks and soldiers. And they also needed they had several Frenchmen that were very familiar with the Native Americans. In fact, one of the Frenchmen was married to a Native American girl, 16 years old, and we'll talk about her, Sacagawea, right? So anyway, on March 14th, 1804, they were launched into the Missouri River and right north of St. Louis, Missouri. And they followed the Missouri River all the way north to Bismarck, North Dakota, which would go up there through Missouri, up through, the Iowa border, through Sioux City, actually, where we find in Sioux City, the only person that died on the expedition would die in Sioux City, Iowa. That's would be Sergeant Floyd, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But anyway, they built a small fort when they got to Bismarck, North Dakota, and they spent their whole winter with the Mandan Indians, which helped take care of them in North Dakota. Sacagawea was a valuable guide. In fact, if she was not on the journey, they may not have survived. And she had a baby on her back the whole time. So the Mandan Indians provided the expedition with a valuable aid. And this was through the Frenchman too, that was her husband. And she was a Shoshone Indian. And her name was Sacagawea, and she lived 1788 to 1812. She was 16 years old at the time. And she was accompanied by her French-Canadian husband. And Sacagawea was very valuable because she could speak the native languages. She was an interpreter and she was a guide. In fact, she helped the explorers obtain horses from the natives and prevented them from being killed. On the way, she actually met her brother in one of the tribes that she had encountered, and because she was involved in the group, they decided not to attack the group. So because she was so valuable, she was probably the most valuable guide on the Lewis and Clark expedition, that's for sure. Reaching the Pacific Ocean. So the summer of 1805, Lewis and Clark crossed the Great Divide. So what's the Great Divide here? You see the Great Divide actually separates the rivers flowing to the east, the Atlantic, and the rivers flowing to the west. That's called the Great Divide. After you get over the mountains, they flow to the Pacific after you cross the Rockies. So they crossed the Great Divide. On August 1805, they reached a branch of this Columbia River. So here's a map of it. You see, they're coming up the Missouri River up to Fort Mandan, and now they're coming over here. They'll come onto the Columbia River here, and the Columbia River will take them all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And they spent the winter at the mouth of the Columbia River on the Pacific Ocean. So spending the river clear up here as you talk up at that area. It wasn't Washington, it area of Washington and Oregon, but now this area here was part of the Louisiana Purchase. And they spent the winter at the mouth of it, and then they began their long journey back. Actually, this area was the Oregon country, which was claimed by Great Britain from Russia. So once they got across the Louisiana territory here and went into this territory here, they weren't in the Louisiana Purchase, but they went through peaceably through this Oregon country, I should say, onto not really country. We'd say basically it's called Oregon country, but it's Oregon territory, I should say, onto Fort Clatsop, which would be on the Columbia River. And they spent the winter there, and then they after that winter, began their long journey back. On September 23rd, 1806, they arrived in St. Louis, Missouri. See, there's St. Louis where they started, St. Louis all the way this way, coming all the way back. You can see the map as they come back. And this was the Louisiana Purchase here. Later on, we would purchase the Oregon Territory. So, okay, and this covered 8,000 miles. They arrived in 1806, and they had started there. Basically, it took them more than 2 years, of traveling. So on September 26, 1806, they arrived in St. Louis, and this was over 2 years, 8,000 miles in over 2 years. They brought back a wealth of information. Lewis and Clark brought back animal skins, dried plants, many samples of all different kinds of life. Meriwether Lewis especially was good at doing that, bringing all these things back. And the only death they had was Sergeant Charles Floyd, and he was a relative of William Clark. William Clark was in charge, Lewis and Clark. Well, he was a relative of Clark. He was a young guy. He was only 22 years old. He was a sergeant. He just was so happy to go. How did he die? Well, now we know he died of a ruptured appendix. He had appendicitis attack, and his appendix ruptured, causing him to go into fever and sepsis, and he ended up dying. Sergeant Charles Floyd. So anyway, when they got back, here's a picture here of him, as you see, Sergeant Choiles, and it says, anyway, he was so excited to go. So it's pretty sad that he's the only one to die of appendicitis, dying of appendix, which now, back then, they had no cure for it, for appendix. If your appendix ruptured, there is no cure, but now we do. Now it is a minor surgery. So anyway, Captain Lewis promptly reported to Washington, D.C., to Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was so ecstatic, so eager to hear all about the journey. Now we'd have the open door to the west. Lewis and Clark discovered several passes through the Rocky Mountains. They also held friendly relations with the Native American tribes, especially the Flathead, the Nez Perce, the Soquok, the Walla Walla, the Clatsop. So they had met all these tribes, and they actually had been friendly to them. So now we have an open door to the west through the Lewis and Clark expedition. So right away, the last part of this video is right away I'm going to talk about another expedition, because right away Thomas Jefferson says we need to get out. We need to now explore the southern. We went to the northern route, clear up there, and now we need to have somebody come explore the south part of Louisiana Purchase. And so he picked this guy, Lieutenant Zebulon Pike. Lieutenant Pike, he lived 1779 to 1813. He had explored the Mississippi River. He was already an explorer. In 1806, the year that Lewis and Clark returned, he was commissioned to lead this expedition to this southern part, which he would follow the Arkansas River. And here's a picture of some of his journeys here, but he followed the Arkansas River and he'd come into the Colorado Rockies. So it's the southern from where they went. And they went up through North Dakota. And he was down in the south. So he discovered Colorado. So he discovered, even in Colorado, if you go there, you'll see Pikes Peak. So even the Rocky Pikes Peak was named for him in Colorado. So then he turned south to the Spanish territory of New Mexico, which is right going through Colorado. He turned Pikes Peak there and he went south here to Santa Fe, down south. And then he didn't know he was crossing into Spanish territory, into Mexico. So Mexico owned New Mexico, and so he was in the wrong territory. So he encountered a squadron there of Spanish soldiers, and the soldiers arrested him and all of his guys, all of his crew, his men. And he arrested them. He took them to Santa Fe, and he put them all in jail for several months and said they didn't know what to do with them. Like, what are they coming over here now, bringing explorers in here in our territory? And so they were upset. They arrested him, but then for several months in jail, they suddenly just allowed him to go home, said, go home. I guess they wanted them to feel that like they couldn't come back, like go home and don't come back to our Mexico, right? So they went back, and of course we know there would be many more expeditions to come through the Louisiana territory. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there. I think that's the last, and we'll go on with Thomas Jefferson's rest of his time as president in the next video.